A virgin mountain man rides down from the high Colorado peaks, his voice echoing through a dusty saloon. "You're built for birthing. I need sons." The room freezes. A fat widow turns to face him, laughter trembling in her throat. But behind that laughter hides a lifetime of loneliness. He needs heirs to keep his land. She needs a reason to believe she's worth loving again. But when they find a half-Apache baby crying in the snow, everything changes. What began as a bargain becomes a fight for faith, land, and mercy in a world where law and love rarely agree. Soldiers want the child. The railroad wants his mountain. And the woman he chose may be the only one brave enough to save them all. As winter closes in and justice turns its back, will a man who's never known love learn to fight for it, or lose everything he never knew he needed? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The rising sun painted Aspen Gulch's weathered buildings in shades of amber and gold. Bessie Holt stood before her looking-glass, studying her reflection with unusual care. Her work-worn hands smoothed the front of her best dress, a practical brown cotton affair that had seen better days, but was clean and properly mended. She'd risen before dawn to heat water for washing, determined to face this day with dignity. The events of yesterday still seemed like a dream. That mountain of a man, Jonas Creed, standing up in Whitaker's saloon, defending her honor with those blunt words that had silenced every mocking tongue in the room. "You're built for birthing. I need sons." Bessie's cheeks warmed at the memory. No man had spoken up for her since Thomas died 3 years ago. Most folks in town treated her like a fixture in the boarding house kitchen, useful for cooking their meals but otherwise invisible, except when they were cruel. She pinned her thick brown hair into a neat bun, remembering how Jonas Creed's deep-set eyes had held hers across the smoky saloon. There'd been no mockery there, no hidden meanness, just straightforward purpose, like everything else about him. "Lord," she whispered, touching the small cross at her throat, "give me wisdom to know your will in this." The boarding house kitchen was quiet this early. Bessie moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, stoking the stove and setting water to boil for coffee. The familiar tasks helped settle her nerves. Through the window, she watched the town slowly come to life, Mr. Peterson opening his mercantile, Mrs. Webb sweeping her porch across the way. The back door creaked open precisely at 7 o'clock. Jonas Creed had to duck his head to enter, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe. He'd cleaned up some since yesterday, his dark beard trimmed neater, but he still carried the wild look of the mountains about him. His clothes were plain, but well-maintained, a sign of practical care that Bessie noted with approval. "Morning, Miss Holt," he said, removing his hat. "Thought we might talk proper, if you've a mind to." Bessie gestured to the kitchen table. "Coffee's nearly ready. Sit yourself down, Mr. Creed." He folded himself onto one of her sturdy chairs, and Bessie was grateful she kept everything built solid in her kitchen. Too many delicate things had broken under careless hands over the years. She poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one before him along with a plate of fresh biscuits. Taking the seat across from him, she studied him openly. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined around the eyes, but those eyes themselves were clear and direct. Patient, waiting for her to speak first. "You surprised everyone yesterday," she said finally. "Including me." Jonas nodded, wrapping his big hands around the coffee cup. "Wasn't planning to speak up like that, but I won't apologize for it. Those men needed shutting up." "That they did." Bessie allowed herself a small smile. "Though most folks would have found a different way to do it." "I'm not most folks." He took a sip of coffee, approval flickering across his features. Been up in the high country 15 years now. Forgot how to dance around things proper like. Why come down now? Railroad's coming. Need to register my claim before they try taking it. Got 200 acres of good grazing land up there and a solid cabin. Built it myself. He paused, studying her face. It's a good place. Lonely, though. Bessie felt her heart quicken, but kept her voice steady. I heard tell you had a family once. Pain flashed in his eyes, there and gone like summer lightning. Lost them to smallpox. Wife and 2 boys. His voice was rough. 15 years ago now. I'm sorry. Bessie meant it. She knew the weight of grief, how it could hollow a person out. My Thomas, he died 3 years past. Fell down drunk and hit his head. Folks here never let me forget it. Jonas's jaw tightened. Small-minded people, taking pleasure in others' pain. Yes. Bessie broke open a biscuit, letting the steam escape. Mr. Creed, what you said yesterday, was that just to silence those men, or did you mean it? Both. He set his cup down carefully. Wasn't planning to speak up like that, but every word was true. I'm looking for a wife, someone strong, honest, God-fearing, someone who can help me build something worth having up there. His eyes met hers steadily. Someone like you. Bessie felt her cheeks warm again, but held his gaze. You don't know me, Mr. Creed. Know enough. Been watching since I came to town 3 days ago. Seen how you run that kitchen, how you treat folks fair even when they don't deserve it. Seen your faith in action, not just words. He leaned forward slightly. And I reckon you know something about loss, too. Makes a person either bitter or better. You chose better. Tears pricked at Bessie's eyes, but she blinked them back. No one had seen her so, clearly in years. It's not an easy thing you're proposing. Living up in the high country, away from everything familiar? No, Jonas agreed. Won't be easy, but I reckon we could build something good together, something honest. He hesitated, then added more softly. Maybe even find some healing. Bessie looked down at her hands, strong hands, capable of kneading bread and managing a household. Could they build a new life too? I'd need to know more, she said carefully. About the land, the cabin, what you're expecting? Jonas nodded, respect warming his expression. Smart woman. I'll tell you everything you want to know. But first, are you interested at all in considering it? Bessie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Yesterday morning, she'd woken to another day of drudgery and quiet desperation. Now here sat a man offering her a complete change of life. It terrified her. It thrilled her too. Yes, she said finally. I'm interested in considering it. Relief softened the hard lines of Jonas's face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Brought you something. Map of my place? Drew it myself. Thought you might want to see what you'd be getting into. Bessie unfolded the careful drawing. The cabin sat in a protected valley, with a creek running nearby. Gardens were marked, and grazing lands, and a spring house. It was a thoughtful layout, practical, but with beauty too. He'd noted the best spots for wildflowers and where the sunset lit up the valley. It's well planned, she said, tracing the lines with one finger. Been working on it 15 years, making it ready, though I didn't know what for. His voice roughened again. Took me a long time to believe I might deserve another chance at family. Bessie looked up at him, seeing past the massive frame and weather-beaten exterior to the heart beneath. A good heart, she thought, though wounded, like her own. Mr. Creed, Jonas, she said carefully, I need to pray on this. It's not a small thing you're asking. No, it ain't. He stood, settling his hat back on his head. I'll be in town 3 more days, getting my claim registered. Take whatever time you need to think on it." He paused at the door. "But Miss Holt, Bessie, I meant what I said yesterday. You're a fine woman. Don't let anyone tell you different." After he left, Bessie sat for a long time at her kitchen table, looking at the map he'd drawn. The morning light streamed through her window, touching everything with gold, making ordinary things look new and full of possibility. She thought about the loneliness of her life here, cooking for others but never really belonging. Thought about the whispers and sneers that followed her through town. Thought about Jonas Creed's steady gaze and careful hands, the way he'd defended her without hesitation. "Lord," she whispered again, "is this the answer to my prayers? Or is it just me being desperate to escape?" No immediate answer came, but peace settled over her like a warm shawl. She had 3 days to decide, 3 days to pray, to think, to ask questions, 3 days to determine if this unexpected offer was truly God's provision or simply human desperation. Bessie carefully folded the map and tucked it into her Bible for safekeeping. Then she stood and began preparing breakfast for her boarders, her mind already forming the questions she would ask Jonas tomorrow. About faith and family, about expectations and dreams, about building something new from the ashes of loss. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another hot day in Aspen Gulch. But for the first time in years, Bessie felt the stirring of hope in her heart, as fresh and fragrant as new-baked bread, as strong and steady as the mountains themselves. The morning sun beat down on the dusty street as Bessie spotted Jonas loading supplies into his cart outside the general store. Her heart thumped against her ribs, but she squared her shoulders and marched forward, her boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. Several townsfolk paused to watch, no doubt expecting another spectacle. Jonas looked up at her approach, his expression carefully neutral. Before he could speak, Bessie planted her hands on her hips and shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "You've got nerve, mountain man," she said, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Coming down here after 15 years and thinking you can just announce your intentions like you're buying a horse at auction." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Jonas's weathered face. He straightened to his full height, towering over her. But Bessie wasn't intimidated. She'd spent too many years dealing with rough men to be cowed by size alone. "Miss Holt, he began. "Oh, now it's Miss Holt, is it?" Bessie's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Yesterday you were telling the whole town I was built for birthing. Land sakes, Mr. Creed, haven't you learned that's no way to court a lady?" A few chuckles rose from the growing crowd. Jonas's ears reddened beneath his thick beard, but he held her gaze. "Never claimed to be good at courting," he said gruffly. "Just honest about what I'm looking for." "Well then, let me be honest too." Bessie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I've been thinking about your offer, and I have a counter-proposal." Jonas's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm listening." "I'll go up to your mountain with you," she said. "But not as your wife, not yet. We'll be partners through the winter, nothing more. Come spring, if we both reckon it's right, then we can talk about marriage." Jonas frowned. "That's a long time to wait." "That's right," Bessie nodded. "Long enough to prove your character, and mine too. Long enough to be sure we're following God's will and not just running from loneliness." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Jonas ignored them, his eyes fixed on Bessie's face. She could almost see him turning the idea over in his mind, like a prospector examining ore for value. "Partners," he said slowly. "What exactly does that mean to you?" "It means I'll cook, keep house, help with the work that needs doing. You'll provide shelter, protection, and treat me with respect." Bessie's voice was firm. "We'll learn to work together, see if we can build something worth having. But there'll be no liberties taken, Mr. Creed, not until we're properly married, if we decide that's God's plan for us." Jonas nodded, something like admiration warming his stern features. "Fair terms," he said. "And wise ones too, I reckon." He held out his massive hand. "Partners, then?" Bessie took it, her strong fingers disappearing in his grip. "Partners." "Well, I never." Mrs. Whitaker's scandalized voice cut through the morning air. "Bessie Holt, you can't mean to go off alone with that mountain man." "And why not?" Bessie turned to face the older woman, chin held high. "I'm a grown woman, Mrs. Whitaker, free to make my own choices." "But it ain't proper," someone else called out. "They ain't even matched." Jonas stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the street. "Proper's got nothing to do with it," he rumbled. "We're making an honest agreement between two people seeking God's will. Anyone who's got a problem with that can keep it to themselves." Bessie felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. Here was a man who wouldn't shame her or hide her away. Whatever else came of their arrangement, that alone was worth something. "Now then," she said briskly, "if you'll help me with my shopping, Mr. Creed, we've got preparations to make." Inside the general store, Mr. Peterson watched with undisguised curiosity as they selected supplies. Bessie moved efficiently through the shelves, her experienced eye assessing what they'd need for the coming months. 20 pounds of flour, she told Mr. Peterson, and 15 pounds of sugar. Salt, too, a good amount. We'll need it for preserving. Jonas added his own items to the growing pile: axe handles, rifle cartridges, leather strapping. When Bessie placed a dozen candles on the counter, he nodded approvingly. "Gets dark early up there," he said. "Nights are long in winter." "Speaking of winter," Bessie added, writing paper and pencils to their purchases, "how long before the snow makes the trail impassable?" "First real snow usually comes by mid-October," Jonas replied. "We've got maybe 3 weeks to get settled before then." Mr. Peterson tallied their purchases, his pencil scratching across paper. "That'll be $12.43, he announced. "Plus another $2 if you want that barrel of apples there." "We'll take the apples," Bessie said firmly. "Can't let good fruit go to waste." Jonas paid without comment, though his eyes crinkled slightly at her decisive tone. Together they loaded the supplies into his cart, ignoring the stares and whispers from passing townfolk. "I need to fetch my things," Bessie said when they finished. "Won't take but an hour to pack." Jonas nodded. "I'll check the mule's harness while I wait." In her small room above the boarding house kitchen, Bessie moved quickly. She packed her clothes, sturdy work dresses, warm shawls, her mother's quilted petticoat. Her Bible went in next, along with Jonas's carefully drawn map. A few precious books, her sewing kit, the photographs of her parents and Thomas. Mrs. Whitaker appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Bessie, you can't be serious about this. That man's been living like a wild thing up in those mountains. Who knows what he might do?" Bessie continued packing, tucking her mother's silver thimble into a sock for safekeeping. "Jonas Creed's not wild, Mrs. Whitaker. He's lonely and direct, but I've seen nothing but honesty and respect from him." "But your reputation—" "My reputation?" Bessie straightened, fixing the older woman with a steady look. "The same reputation this town's been picking apart since Thomas died? The one that's nothing but whispers about my size and my dead drunk husband?" She shook her head. "I'm done letting other people's opinions chain me down. I'm making my own choice this time." Mrs. Whitaker's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened. "Well, when you put it that way. Just be careful, dear, and know you can always come back if things don't work out." "Thank you," Bessie said sincerely. "I'll write when I can." She took one last look around the room that had been her home for 3 years. It felt smaller somehow, as if she'd already outgrown it. Everything that mattered was packed in her trunk and carpet bag. Jonas was waiting by the cart, checking the harness one final time. He lifted her trunk easily, securing it alongside their supplies. The afternoon sun was sliding toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. "Ready?" he asked simply. Bessie nodded, accepting his hand up onto the seat. "Ready." The mules started forward at Jonas's quiet command. As they passed the church, Bessie saw several women gathered on the steps, no doubt discussing this latest scandal. She lifted her hand in a peaceful farewell. They were nearly at the edge of town when the first snowflakes began to fall. Just a few at first, then more, dancing on the cooling air. Bessie turned to look back at Aspen Gulch, watching the lights begin to twinkle in windows as dusk gathered. The town looked almost pretty from here, softened by distance and falling snow. "Having second thoughts?" Jonas asked quietly. "No," Bessie said, surprising herself with how true it felt. "Just saying goodbye to one chapter and hello to another?" Jonas nodded, his profile strong against the darkening sky. "Trail gets steep from here," he warned. "Might want to hold on." Bessie gripped the seat more firmly as the mules began the upward climb. Behind them, Aspen Gulch disappeared into the gathering darkness, taking its gossip and loneliness with it. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and maybe, just maybe, something worth building together. The snow fell more thickly now, blessing their departure with white peace. Bessie pulled her shawl closer and smiled. Whatever came next, she knew in her heart that she'd made the right choice. Not running away, but moving forward. Not settling, but seeking something true. The cart creaked steadily upward as the last light faded from the sky. Jonas began pointing out landmarks, his deep voice mixing with the jingling harness and the soft sound of falling snow. Bessie listened, already beginning to map this new world in her mind, ready to face whatever adventures and challenges lay ahead. The mule cart groaned as it navigated the narrow mountain trail, its wheels finding every rock and rut along the way. Dawn had broken clear and cold, painting the Colorado peaks in shades of rose and gold, but now heavy clouds rolled in, threatening more snow. Jonas walked ahead, leading the mules with practiced patience. His boots crunched through patches of ice that had formed overnight, testing each step before committing his weight. The trail grew steeper with each mile, winding through stands of pine and aspen that creaked in the wind. Bessie sat wrapped in blankets on the wagon seat, her hands tucked into worn leather gloves. Despite the biting cold, her eyes sparkled as she took in the magnificent views. Every so often she'd point out something that caught her attention, a hawk circling overhead, or the way sunlight broke through the clouds to spotlight a distant peak. "Lord above, but it's beautiful up here," she breathed, her words forming white puffs in the frigid air. "Though I reckon it gets mighty lonely in winter." Jonas glanced back, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. "Quiet's good for thinking," he said. "But yes, it gets lonely." The mules picked their way around a sharp bend, hooves sliding slightly on the icy ground. Jonas steadied them with quiet words and a firm hand on the lead rope. Bessie gripped the seat tighter but made no sound of complaint. "You handle the trail well," Jonas observed after a while. "Most folks would be fretting by now." Bessie chuckled, the warm sound echoing off the rocky walls beside them. "Oh, I'm fretting all right, just keeping it to myself. Besides," she added with a hint of pride, "I've never been one to make things harder by complaining about what can't be changed." A ghost of a smile crossed Jonas's face. Wise woman. They made slow progress through the afternoon, stopping occasionally to rest the mules and check the wagon's wheels. Bessie used these breaks to stretch her legs and share out bread and dried apple slices. She noticed how Jonas always positioned himself between her and the steep drop-offs, his massive frame blocking the worst of the wind. As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Jonas led them off the main trail to a sheltered hollow beside a creek. The spot showed signs of previous use. A crude fire ring stacked firewood under a lean-to made of pine boughs. "We'll camp here," he announced. "Creek's good for water, and the ridge blocks the worst of the wind." Bessie climbed down from the wagon, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. Without being asked, she began gathering kindling while Jonas tended to the mules. They worked in comfortable silence, each falling into natural tasks that needed doing. Soon, a small fire crackled beneath a canvas shelter Jonas had rigged. The coffee pot bubbled cheerfully, and the smell of warming beans filled the air. Bessie had produced fresh biscuits from her travel stores, and Jonas's eyebrows rose appreciatively at the sight. "You come prepared," he said, accepting one with a nod of thanks. "A good cook's always prepared," she replied, settling onto a log he'd rolled near the fire. "Though I expect we'll be eating simpler once these run out." The night deepened around them, stars appearing in breaks between the clouds. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, long and lonely. Another answered from further away. Bessie showed no sign of fear, just cocked her head to listen. Jonas watched her carefully. "Wolves don't trouble you?" "They're God's creatures, same as us," she said simply, "though I wouldn't care to meet one up close, mind you." They shared the last of the coffee as the fire burned low. The wolves called again, closer now, but the mules remained calm in their makeshift corral. Bessie wrapped herself in blankets and settled into the wagon bed, while Jonas took first watch. The second day passed much like the first, slow progress up increasingly difficult trails. The weather held, but the wind carried the promise of snow. By afternoon, they'd climbed high enough that the air felt noticeably thinner. Bessie's breathing grew a bit labored, but she waved off Jonas's concern. "Just need to get my mountain legs," she assured him. "Can't expect valley lungs to adjust right away." The third morning dawned gray and cold. They'd barely started when Jonas raised his hand, signaling a halt. His head lifted, nostrils flaring. "Smoke," he said tersely. "Not weather-caused?" Bessie scanned the horizon. "There, in that hollow." A thin column of dark smoke rose against the cloudy sky. Jonas frowned. "No one should be camping up here now. Trail's too dangerous." He tied off the mules. "Wait here while I check." "I will not," Bessie said firmly, already climbing down. "2 pairs of eyes are better than 1, and I can handle myself." He looked like he might argue, then nodded shortly. "Stay behind me. Step where I step." They moved carefully through the trees, Jonas's hand never far from his rifle. As they drew closer, the acrid smell of burnt wood and something else, something worse, filled the air. Bessie pressed her sleeve against her nose. The scene in the hollow stopped them both. A wagon lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the cold wind. Smoke still rose from its burned remains, though the fire had mostly burned itself out. Personal belongings lay scattered across the ground: clothes, cooking implements, a child's wooden horse. Jonas moved forward first, checking the area with the caution of a hunter. "No bodies," he said quietly, "but there's blood on the ground here, and boot prints, several men heading east." Bessie's heart ached at the destruction, but something else caught her attention, a sound so faint she might have imagined it. She moved toward the wagon's remains, ignoring Jonas's warning hiss. There, wrapped in a soot-stained blanket beneath a fallen canvas, lay a tiny bundle. As she watched, it moved slightly. "Jonas!" she called sharply. "Come quick!" He was beside her in an instant, rifle ready. Then he saw what she'd found. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, its face streaked with ash, but somehow, miraculously, still breathing. Dark eyes opened as Bessie carefully lifted the bundle. "He's alive," she breathed. "Lord have mercy, he's alive." Jonas studied the child grimly. "Apache," he said, noting the baby's features. "Must have been a raid. Soldiers will want to know about this." "Soldiers?" Bessie cradled the infant closer as it began to whimper. "This baby needs care now, not some long ride to a fort. He's half frozen and probably starving." "Bessie," Jonas's voice held warning. "This isn't our concern. The army handles Indian affairs." She turned on him, eyes blazing. "This isn't an affair," Jonas creed. "This is a child, a baby who needs help. I won't hear talk of turning him over to soldiers who'd likely let him die of neglect." The baby's whimpers turned to weak cries. Without thinking, Bessie opened her coat and tucked him against her warmth. "Shh, little one," she soothed. "You're safe now." Jonas watched the scene with troubled eyes. "What do you propose we do with him?" "We take him with us, of course. Get him warm and fed." Her voice softened as she looked down at the tiny face. "I'll call him Thomas, after my husband's father. He was a good man who believed in helping anyone in need." "Bessie," Jonas tried again, but she cut him off. "I know what you're thinking, that it's not practical, that it complicates things. Well, maybe God sent us this way for a reason. I won't abandon a child who needs help, no matter who his parents were." She met his gaze steadily. "If that changes your mind about our arrangement, so be it." Long moments passed as Jonas stood silent, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, his shoulders dropped slightly. "We'll need milk," he said gruffly. "There's a goat farm 2 miles west. Man there owes me a favor." Relief and gratitude washed over Bessie's face. "Thank you," she said softly. Jonas just nodded and turned back toward their wagon. "I'll get the mules. You keep him warm. Weather's turning colder." Bessie looked down at the baby in her arms, now sleeping fitfully, against her chest. "Don't you worry, little Thomas," she whispered. "God hasn't forgotten you, and neither will we." The wind picked up as they left the hollow, carrying the first few snowflakes. Behind them, smoke still rose from the burned wagon, a marker of lives changed and paths altered by chance or providence. Bessie held Thomas close as the mules picked their careful way higher into the mountains, toward Jonas's cabin and whatever future awaited them all. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains, winding through stands of snow-laden pine. Late afternoon shadows stretched long across the frozen ground when Jonas finally raised his hand, pointing ahead. "There," he said simply. Bessie, Thomas bundled securely against her chest, leaned forward to see. The cabin sat in a natural hollow, rough-hewn logs silvered by weather and time. A thin thread of creek wound past it, its surface gleaming like broken glass in the fading light. The structure wasn't large, perhaps 20 feet square, but its foundations looked solid, anchored to the mountain as surely as the pines themselves. Jonas guided the mules to a lean-to shelter beside the cabin. "It ain't much," he said gruffly, helping Bessie down from the wagon. "Been a while since anyone but me lived here." "It's shelter," Bessie replied practically, though her heart sank a little as they approached the door. That's what matters now. The cabin's interior confirmed her fears. 15 years of solitary male habitation had left their mark. Dust lay thick on every surface. Spiderwebs draped the corners like tattered lace. The single window, its oiled paper yellowed and cracking, let in weak light that revealed a cheerless space. One bed against the wall, a pot-bellied stove, a rough table with a single chair. The air hung stale and cold. But Bessie was nothing if not practical. She'd managed worse in her time. "First things first," she announced, settling Thomas into a makeshift bed of blankets. "We need water, wood, and warmth. The rest can wait." Jonas nodded, clearly relieved to have direction. "I'll see to the mules and bring in wood." He paused awkwardly. "There's a pump out back. Might need priming." While Jonas worked outside, Bessie took stock of her new domain. The stove, at least, was well maintained. Jonas clearly understood the importance of heat in these mountains. She found an old broom behind the door and began sweeping, clouds of dust billowing in the wan light. A shelf held basic provisions: coffee, flour, salt pork, all showing Jonas's preference for practicality over comfort. The door creaked open as Jonas carried in the first armload of split wood. He stacked it carefully by the stove, then paused, watching as Bessie hung her prized quilt over the drafty wall beside the bed. The cheerful pattern, a sunrise of reds and yellows, stood in stark contrast to the cabin's grayness. "Bring some color," he said quietly. Bessie smiled, pleased. He'd noticed. "My mother made it. Said every home needs something beautiful." She turned back to her sweeping. "Even temporary ones." Jonas's shoulders stiffened slightly at that reminder of their arrangement, but he said nothing, just returned to his wood splitting. The steady thunk of the axe provided rhythm to Bessie's work as she cleaned, organized, and slowly transformed the space. By nightfall, the cabin had taken on a different character. Water boiled on the stove, steam carrying away the musty air. The floor was swept, the table scrubbed, and Bessie's few possessions arranged with care. She'd found an old crate that, turned on its side, made a serviceable cradle for Thomas. The baby had been remarkably good-natured throughout the day's journey, but as darkness fell, he began to fuss. The goat's milk they'd obtained helped, but he was clearly uncomfortable in the strange surroundings. His cries grew more insistent as Bessie tried to settle him. Jonas, who had been carefully maintaining his distance, surprised her by approaching. "May I?" he asked hesitantly. Bessie blinked, but handed Thomas over. The sight was almost comical, this massive, bearded mountain man cradling such a tiny bundle. Jonas's hands, rough from years of trapping and working wood, seemed enormous against Thomas's small form. But there was unexpected gentleness in his touch. His attempts at rocking were awkward, more of a sway, really, but Thomas's cries began to soften. Bessie stepped closer, guiding Jonas's arms into a better position. "Like this," she said softly. "Support his head. There you go." Their hands brushed briefly, and she felt Jonas tense, but he didn't pull away. "Had forgotten," he murmured, almost to himself. "How small they are." Something in his voice made Bessie's heart ache. She'd known he'd lost family. Gossip had followed him even after he'd retreated to the mountains. But this was the first hint he'd given of that pain. Thomas drifted to sleep in Jonas's arms. Tiny fingers curled against the rough wool of his shirt. For a moment, the three of them stood in tableau, a strange little family formed by circumstance and need. Finally, Jonas carefully laid Thomas in his makeshift cradle. Without a word, he took his rifle and headed for the door. "Traps need checking," he said shortly. "Back by supper." Bessie watched him go, understanding his need for space. The day had brought more change than either of them had expected. She turned her attention to making the cabin's first real meal in probably 15 years. Dawn was just breaking when Jonas returned, his breath frosting in the cold air. 3 rabbits hung from his belt, already cleaned. Bessie had coffee waiting, its rich aroma filling the small space. They worked in comfortable silence, Jonas skinning the rabbits while Bessie prepared them for the pot with vegetables she'd brought from town. As the stew simmered, sending savory smells through the cabin, the first real snowflakes began to fall outside the window. Thomas slept peacefully, and the fire crackled in the stove. Something about the moment, the warmth, the food, the gathering storm outside, seemed to loosen something in Jonas. "Had a family once," he said abruptly, staring into his coffee cup. "Wife, 2 boys." Bessie kept her movements slow and steady, letting him find his words. "Smallpox took them. 15 years ago now." His voice was rough. "Couldn't save them. Couldn't do anything but watch them suffer." His huge hands clenched around the cup. "Seemed easier to come up here after. Be alone." "Grief does strange things to us," Bessie said softly. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "My Thomas, my husband, he drank himself to death 3 years ago. Townfolk never let me forget it was my fault somehow. Said if I'd been prettier, more delicate, he wouldn't have turned to the bottle." She gave a small, bitter laugh. As if being dainty would have made him stronger. Jonas looked up sharply. "Man makes his own choices," he said firmly. "Ain't your burden to carry." "Just as your family's death wasn't yours," Bessie replied gently. Their eyes met across the table, 2 people who understood loss, who had built walls against further pain. Outside the snow fell thicker, but inside the fire burned bright and steady. Thomas stirred in his sleep, making small, snuffling noises that somehow made the cabin feel more like a home than it had in 15 years. The moment stretched, full of unspoken things. Then Bessie rose to check the stew, and Jonas went to add wood to the fire, and life moved forward as it always did. But something had shifted, some first crack in the walls they'd built. As evening settled over the mountain, the cabin glowed with warmth that came from more than just the stove. The winter wind howled outside Jonas Creed's mountain cabin, but inside, warmth and routine had begun to settle into the small space. December's early darkness meant long evenings by lamplight, where the unlikely family of 3 found their rhythm in shared silence and simple tasks. Bessie sat in the cabin's only chair, darning one of Jonas's thick wool socks by the stove's glow. Her strong fingers moved steadily, closing holes worn by too many miles in snow-crusted boots. Across the room, Jonas whittled by the window, his big hands surprisingly delicate as they shaped a small wooden horse. On a blanket between them, baby Thomas cooed at his own fingers, kicking his feet in contentment. The domesticity of the scene would have shocked the townsfolk of Aspen Gulch. But here, away from judging eyes, something like peace had begun to take root. "Need to teach you to move in deep snow," Jonas said suddenly, breaking the quiet. His eyes remained on his carving. "Can't have you stuck inside all winter." Bessie looked up from her mending. "Reckon you mean those snowshoes I saw hanging by the door?" Jonas nodded. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. Thomas can stay warm. In that sling you made." The next morning dawned bright and bitter cold. Frost patterns decorated the oiled paper window, and their breath clouded in the air until the stove worked its magic. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, they bundled Thomas securely in the sling Bessie had fashioned from an old blanket. Outside, Jonas demonstrated how to strap on the snowshoes, wooden frames laced with raw hide that seemed impossibly large to Bessie's eyes. "Like walking with platforms strapped to your feet," he explained, showing her how to adjust her stride. Bessie's first attempts were less than graceful. She toppled more than once into the powder-soft drifts, but her laughter rang out across the silent mountainside. Jonas found himself fighting back a smile as he helped her up again and again. "You're doing better than most," he admitted, steadying her with one hand while the other hovered protectively near Thomas in his sling. Took me near a week to stop falling every other step. By midday, Bessie had mastered the basics. Jonas led her in widening circles around the cabin, teaching her to read the snow's consistency and choose safe paths. Thomas slept peacefully against her chest, lulled by the rhythmic movement. "Show me your snares next," Bessie said, her cheeks pink with cold and exertion. "Can't have you doing all the hunting yourself?" Jonas's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Over the next hour, he demonstrated how to set simple rabbit snares, explaining how to identify game trails and choose the best placement. Bessie's clever fingers quickly learned the knots, and her practical mind grasped the strategy behind each placement. "You're a quick study," Jonas commented as they headed back to the cabin. "Had to be," Bessie replied. "Running a boarding house kitchen means adapting fast or failing faster." The days fell into a pattern after that. Mornings began with Bessie warming milk for Thomas, while Jonas checked the nearest snares. They shared breakfast at the rough table, where Bessie had taken to saying grace before meals. Jonas never joined in the prayers, but he waited respectfully, head bowed, until she finished. Afternoons found them working separately but in harmony, Jonas splitting wood or maintaining his tools, while Bessie tended to domestic tasks. She'd begun turning the cabin into something that resembled a home, her small touches appearing in corners and on shelves. A row of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a whittled toy Jonas had made for Thomas propped on the windowsill, her mother's quilt adding color to the wall. But it was the evenings that brought the most change. As winter deepened, the long hours of darkness seemed to loosen something in Jonas. He began to share small stories while they worked. Tales of his trapping days, memories of the mountains in different seasons. Bessie listened, asking questions that showed she understood the land's importance to him. One particularly cold morning, Jonas returned from checking his trap line with tension in his shoulders. He stamped the snow from his boots more forcefully than necessary, his face grim beneath his beard. "Found tracks," he said finally, accepting the cup of coffee Bessie handed him. "Boot prints, railroad surveyors by the look of them." Bessie felt her heart sink. She'd heard talk in town about the railroad's expansion plans, about how they were claiming land all through the territory. "How close?" "Too close." Jonas's hands tightened around his cup. "Less than a mile from here. They're mapping these hills, looking for the best route through." He was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas play on his blanket. "There's something you should know." Bessie waited, recognizing the weight in his voice. "My land deed," he continued roughly. "The original burned years back, in a lightning strike that took my first cabin. Never bothered getting it properly rewritten. Wasn't anyone up here to challenge my claim then." His laugh was bitter. "Railroad won't care about squatters' rights or a man's word. They'll want paper proof." Understanding dawned in Bessie's eyes. This was why he'd come down to town that first day. Not just for supplies, but to try to register his claim before the railroad could challenge it. But without the original deed. She studied him for a long moment, this proud mountain man who'd carved a life out of wilderness. Then she looked around the cabin that was slowly becoming home to all three of them. Her decision was simple. "Come spring," she said firmly, "we'll rewrite those papers proper." At his surprised look, she added, "I can read and write well enough to help with that. Kept all the books for the boarding house, didn't I? Between us, we'll make sure your claim's legal and tight." Jonas stared at her, something flickering in his eyes that might have been hope. "Thought you were only staying until spring." Bessie met his gaze steadily. "Reckon some things are worth seeing through." She turned back to her work, adding casually, "Besides, Thomas seems to like it here." That evening, as snow fell softly outside, Bessie sat at the table with paper and pencil, making notes about what they'd need from town to properly document Jonas's claim. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of beans cooking and the sound of Jonas's low voice as he told Thomas a story about mountain sheep. Looking up, Bessie caught Jonas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between wonder and fear, as if he couldn't quite believe this small family was real. The railroad's threat hung over them like storm clouds on the horizon. But for now, in the lamplight's glow, they had warmth and purpose and each other. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, peace settled over the cabin like the snow outside, softly, steadily, making everything new. Thomas's happy gurgle drew both their attention. The baby reached for Jonas with complete trust, and the mountain man's weathered face softened as he lifted him. Bessie returned to her notes, but her heart felt full. Whatever spring might bring, they would face it together. The evening passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the scratch of Bessie's pencil, and the soft murmur of Jonas's voice as he continued his story about the mountain sheep. Outside, the snow fell thicker, but inside, hope burned warm and steady as the fire in the stove. The storm arrived without warning. One moment the mountain air was crisp and still. The next, dark clouds rolled in like a stampeding herd, bringing winds that made the cabin's timbers groan. Jonas had just finished bringing in extra firewood when the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. "Might want to fetch more water," he said to Bessie, who was already reaching for the buckets. "This one looks mean." Within an hour, the world outside disappeared behind a wall of white. Wind howled through every crack in the cabin walls, and snow pressed against the windows until only a dim, gray light filtered through. Thomas, unsettled by the storm's violence, fussed in his makeshift cradle until Bessie scooped him up. "Hush now, little one," she murmured, bouncing him gently. "It's just the wind having itself a dance." Jonas built up the fire until it roared nearly as loud as the storm. The warmth pushed back against the cold, trying to creep in under the door and through the chinks between logs. Bessie had Thomas wrapped in her quilt, singing soft lullabies that barely carried over the wind's fury. As evening approached, though time was hard to mark in the storm's gray light, Jonas noticed Bessie eyeing his old trunk in the corner. She'd been careful about respecting his privacy, never opening it without asking, but he'd seen her curiosity. "Go ahead," he said gruffly, nodding toward it. "Might find something useful in there." Bessie balanced Thomas on her hip as she knelt beside the trunk. Inside, beneath old clothes and trapping supplies, her hands found something wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully unwrapping it, she revealed a leather-bound Bible, its pages yellow with age. "It was my mother's," Jonas said quietly, the first time he'd mentioned his family without prompting. "She read from it every night, even after the work nearly broke her hands." Bessie ran her fingers gently over the worn cover. "Would you mind if I—" She gestured with the book. Jonas shrugged, but his shoulders were tense as he added another log to the fire. Bessie settled into the chair she'd claimed as hers, Thomas drowsing against her chest. She opened the Bible carefully, its spine crackling with age, and began to read in a clear, steady voice that seemed to soften the storm's edges. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Jonas remained by the fire, his back to her, but his movements slowed as her voice filled the cabin. The familiar words, unspoken for so many years, seemed to hang in the air between them. Thomas drifted off to sleep, soothed by the rhythm of Bessie's voice and the steady beating of her heart. As night fully descended, the storm intensified. Wind shrieked around the cabin's corners like a wounded animal, and snow packed against the walls until they creaked. Bessie had just put Thomas down when she noticed a dark spot spreading across the ceiling. "Jonas," she called, pointing upward. "The roof." He cursed under his breath, already reaching for his coat. "Got to patch it before it gets worse. There's tar paper in the lean-to." "You can't go up there alone in this," Bessie protested, but she could see in his face he'd made up his mind. "Can't leave it neither," he countered. "Water damage'll rot the beams." He pulled on his gloves. "Just need you to steady the ladder." Bessie wrapped herself in her shawl and followed him out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, but Jonas's bulk blocked the worst of it as they retrieved the ladder from the lean-to. Snow stung her face as she braced the ladder's base, her entire body leaning into it to keep it stable. Above her, Jonas worked quickly, his massive form barely visible through the swirling snow. The tar paper flapped violently until he secured it, his movements sure despite the treacherous conditions. Bessie's arms ached from holding the ladder steady, but she didn't dare let go. Finally, Jonas descended, his beard crusted with ice and his hands visibly shaking from cold. Back inside, Bessie immediately sat him by the fire and took his hands in hers. His fingers were like ice, and she rubbed them briskly between her palms. "Foolish man," she scolded, but there was warmth in her voice. "Could have frozen solid up there." Jonas didn't pull away from her touch. "Needed doing," he said simply, but his eyes held hers longer than usual. Through the night, they took turns tending the fire. The storm raged on, but the patch held, and the cabin stayed warm and dry. Bessie read more from the Bible, her voice a counterpoint to the wind's howling. Sometimes Jonas would close his eyes, and she wondered if he was remembering his mother's voice reading those same words. Thomas woke several times, disturbed by the storm's violence. Each time, either Bessie or Jonas would comfort him, their movements around each other becoming more natural, more in sync. When Jonas took the baby, his large hands now confident in their gentleness, Bessie felt something warm unfold in her chest. The storm lasted 2 full days. They passed the time with small tasks, Jonas whittling a new toy for Thomas, Bessie mending clothes and telling stories from her boarding house days. The forced closeness could have been uncomfortable, but instead it felt like a gift, a chance to learn each other's rhythms without the daily pressures of survival. On the morning of the 3rd day, they woke to silence. The wind had died completely, and sunlight streamed through the windows. Jonas opened the door, having to push against the drifted snow, and they stepped out into a transformed world. Everything glittered. The sun caught millions of ice crystals, making the whole mountain shine like it was dusted with diamonds. The air was so clear and cold it hurt to breathe, and the sky above was a perfect, deep blue. Even the familiar shapes of trees and rocks had been transformed into something magical by the snow's artistic hand. Thomas cooed in delight at the brightness, reaching out to grab at the sparkling air. Bessie laughed, her breath making clouds in the frigid morning. She glanced at Jonas and found him watching her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. They stood there together, a small family on a mountaintop, surrounded by a world made new. The storm had changed more than the landscape. It had shifted something between them, created a trust and understanding that went beyond words. As they turned back to the cabin for breakfast, their tracks making the first marks in the pristine snow, Bessie felt a certainty settle in her heart. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Inside, the cabin felt different too, warmer somehow, despite the cold seeping in. As Jonas built up the morning fire and Bessie prepared breakfast, their movements around each other were easy, natural. The Bible still lay open on the table where she'd left it, its familiar presence now a bridge between past and present, between loss and hope. Thomas babbled happily in his cradle, reaching for the strips of sunlight that stretched across the floor. The storm had forged something precious between them all, a foundation of trust and care that felt as solid as the mountain beneath their feet. As Bessie measured coffee into the pot, she caught Jonas watching her again, and this time, when their eyes met, neither looked away. Outside, the new snow glittered under the morning sun, unmarked except for their footprints leading to and from the door. Inside, the cabin was warm, with more than just fire, filled with the quiet certainty of people who had weathered a storm together and come out stronger for it. The day stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility, but for now, they simply enjoyed the peace of the moment, the three of them together in their mountain home. The weeks after the blizzard settled into a gentle rhythm, like snow drifting onto already covered ground. Each day brought small changes to their shared life on the mountain, transformations as subtle as frost patterns on glass, but just as beautiful. Jonas spent his mornings checking trap lines and hunting, returning by midday with whatever game the winter woods provided. One afternoon, he dragged in a fallen pine, its needles still green and fragrant. Instead of cutting it for firewood, he began stripping the bark with careful strokes of his draw knife. Bessie watched him work from her place by the stove, where she kneaded bread dough with practiced hands. "What are you making?" she asked, though she had her suspicions. Jonas ran his hand along the smooth wood. "Figure the boy needs a proper place to sleep," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "Can't keep him in that apple crate forever?" Thomas lay nearby on a quilt, watching snowflakes dance outside the window. At the sound of Jonas's voice, he turned his head and smiled, showing his first tooth. Day by day, the cradle took shape under Jonas's careful hands. He worked in the evenings by lamplight, his massive fingers surprisingly delicate as they carved delicate curves into the headboard. Bessie noticed how he'd pause sometimes, lost in thought, before continuing with renewed purpose. "My pa taught me woodworking," he said one evening, surprising her with the voluntary sharing of his past. "Said a man should know how to build what his family needs." He ran his thumb along a freshly carved edge. "Haven't made nothing like this since." He didn't finish, but Bessie understood. Since his own children. She let the silence hold his grief, knowing some wounds needed air to heal. While Jonas worked with wood, Bessie transformed their sparse home in her own way. She'd brought little from town, but her resourcefulness made up for it. Empty flour sacks, bleached and pressed, became curtains for the windows. She stitched them carefully in the afternoons, while Thomas napped, adding simple embroidered flowers along the edges. "Ain't much to look at," she said when she hung them, "but they'll keep the draft out better than nothing." Jonas studied her handiwork in the fading light. "They're fine curtains," he said firmly. "Real fine." His approval, though simply stated, warmed her more than she expected. The cabin slowly transformed under their combined care. Jonas fixed the loose floorboards that had creaked for years, while Bessie organized his scattered tools and supplies into orderly systems. She hung herbs to dry from the rafters, remedies she'd learned from her mother for winter coughs and fevers. The walls, once bare, now held the curtains and a few treasures. A mirror Jonas had packed away years ago, a wooden spoon Bessie had carved herself, and a small cross she'd found at the bottom of her trunk. One evening, as February's early darkness gathered outside, Bessie stirred a pot of rabbit stew while Jonas worked on the cradle. Thomas played on his quilt, attempting to catch dust motes in the lamplight. The scene was so peaceful, so domestic, that something in Bessie's heart ached with its simple rightness. She began humming as she cooked, an old tune her grandmother had sung in the kitchen. Without thinking, she added words, her rich voice filling the cabin. Sweet Betsy from Pike crossed the mountain so high, crossed the wide prairie, the dear girl did cry. She heard a strange sound and turned to find Jonas chuckling, actually chuckling, at her performance. The sound was rusty, like a door hinge, long unused, but it was genuine laughter. What's so funny? She demanded, trying to look stern, but feeling joy bubble up inside her. You got to the part about the oxen, he explained, still smiling. Made me remember my ma singing that. She'd always act out the oxen dying, had us kids rolling on the floor. Bessie's heart leaped at this glimpse of his happier past. Well then, she said, I reckon I better do it justice. She set down her spoon and launched into an elaborate performance, complete with exaggerated dying ox noises that sent Thomas into fits of giggles. Jonas's laughter grew stronger, more natural. The sound transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and grief. For a moment, Bessie caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before loss carved such deep lines in his face. When the laughter faded, a comfortable silence settled over them. Bessie served the stew in wooden bowls, and they ate together by the fire's light. Thomas dozed in her lap, his small fingers curled around her thumb. I stopped believing, Jonas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. After the fever took them, my Sarah and the boys, I figured God had turned his face away, couldn't see no purpose in it all. Bessie waited, letting him find his words. Burned the family Bible that winter, he continued, shame rough in his voice. Only kept my ma's because I couldn't quite bring myself to destroy her marking in it. Her notes in the margins, you know? The Lord understands grief, Bessie said softly. Better than any of us. Jonas stared into the fire, its light reflecting in his eyes. Been thinking lately. Maybe he wasn't turned away at all. Maybe... He swallowed hard. Maybe he was just waiting till you could father someone else's child? Bessie finished gently. Jonas nodded, unable to speak. In the firelight, she saw moisture gleam in his eyes. Thomas stirred in his sleep, making those soft baby sounds that never failed to tug at her heart. Without thinking, she reached across and took Jonas's hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm and trembling slightly. They sat like that for a long while, connected by touch and trust, and the sleeping child between them. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, an owl called into the night, its voice carrying across the snow-hushed mountain. Jonas didn't pull his hand away until Thomas needed changing. Even then, the connection remained. Something profound had shifted between them, like ice breaking up on a spring river. As Bessie settled Thomas for the night, she heard Jonas murmuring something. It took her a moment to realize he was praying, just a few rough, honest words of gratitude, spoken to the God he was learning to trust again. The cradle was finished the next day. Jonas had carved pine boughs along the headboard, their needles so delicate they seemed real enough to smell. Together, they moved it, near the fire, where the warmth would reach it best. Bessie laid Thomas in it for the first time, tucking him in with the quilt she'd brought from town. There now, she said softly. Your very own bed, little one. Jonas stood back, watching them with an expression that made Bessie's heart twist. There was still pain there, and probably always would be, but now it was mixed with something else. Hope, perhaps, or the beginnings of healing. That night, after Thomas was asleep in his new cradle, Bessie took out Jonas's mother's Bible again. Without being asked, Jonas pulled his chair closer to hear. As she read about Joseph and his coat of many colors, about forgiveness and family restored, she felt the words taking root in both their hearts, like seeds waiting for spring's thaw. The cabin had changed in these weeks, curtains softening the windows, herbs drying from the rafters, a cradle holding precious new life. But the deeper change was in its inhabitants. Where once there had been emptiness and grief, now there was laughter, prayer, and the quiet miracle of 3 lonely souls becoming family. As the fire burned low, and the mountain night pressed close around their warm circle of light, Bessie felt a deep certainty settle in her heart. Whatever God's plan was for them, it was unfolding here in this cabin, in these small moments of grace and healing. She glanced at Jonas, and found him watching her with that same soft expression he'd worn after the blizzard, a look that spoke of trust and gratitude, and maybe something more. Outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, bright and countless in the crystal-clear mountain air. Inside, the cabin held its precious cargo of new beginnings, a man rediscovering his faith, a woman finding her place, and a child who had brought them both back to life. Thomas slept peacefully in his pine cradle, his small breaths joining the quiet sounds of their shared home. The pop of the fire, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind in the eaves. Together they made a song of belonging, a family being built one day at a time. February's bitter grip began to loosen as warmer winds swept down from the peaks. The icicles that had hung like crystal daggers from the cabin's eaves grew thin and dripped steadily, marking time with their liquid metronome. Inside, Jonas packed his gear while Bessie wrapped dried meat and biscuits for his journey. 2 days, he said, checking the straps on his pack. Maybe 3 if the trading's slow. His massive frame filled the doorway as he turned to face her. You got enough wood split? Bessie nodded, bouncing Thomas gently in her arms. Plenty. And I know how to swing an axe if needed. She gave him a pointed look that made the corner of his mouth twitch. We'll manage just fine. Jonas's eyes lingered on Thomas, who was getting bigger by the day. The baby reached out with pudgy fingers, and Jonas let him grab hold of one rough digit. His cough's better, he observed. That willow bark tea did the trick, Bessie said, though he fought me something fierce over drinking it. She adjusted Thomas on her hip, her movements confident and natural. The furs will fetch a good price this time of year. Jonas grunted in agreement, shouldering his pack. The pelts were prime. Beaver, fox, and even a few marten that would bring top dollar from the traders down in Aspen Gulch. He paused at the door, his expression troubled. You remember where I keep the rifle? Above the doorframe, loaded, Bessie answered patiently. And yes, I know how to use it. You showed me 3 times. He nodded, still hesitating. Been seeing tracks lately. Lynx, maybe wolf. Jonas Creed, Bessie said firmly. We will be fine. Now get going before you lose the day's light. Something softened in his face as he looked at them, the strong woman and the small child who had somehow become his family. Without warning, he reached out and touched Thomas's cheek with surprising gentleness. Then he was gone, his heavy boots crunching through the crusty snow. Bessie watched until he disappeared around the bend, Thomas babbling quietly against her shoulder. The mountain air was sharp and clean, carrying the first hints of spring despite the lingering snow. She took a deep breath, savoring the silence, then turned back to the warmth of their cabin. The day passed peacefully enough. Bessie kept busy with her usual tasks, feeding Thomas, sweeping the rough wooden floors, checking the herb stores that hung from the rafters. She sang as she worked, old hymns and trail songs that made Thomas coo and wave his arms. It wasn't until evening that she noticed something was wrong. The chickens Jonas kept in a small coop were making distressed noises, and the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Moving quietly, she lifted Thomas from his cradle and placed him in the center of their bed, building a fortress of quilts around him. Through the window she caught a flash of movement, a tawny shape slinking between the trees. Her heart quickened, but her hands remained steady as she reached for the rifle above the door. Jonas had taught her well. Check the load, cock the hammer, breathe slow and even. The lynx emerged from the shadows, larger than she'd expected. Its tufted ears and powerful shoulders spoke of a creature well equipped for killing. It moved with fluid grace towards the chicken coop, seemingly unaware of her presence. Bessie opened the door just enough to level the rifle. The metal was cold against her cheek as she sighted down the barrel. The lynx turned at the sound, its yellow eyes meeting hers with ancient cunning. For a moment, they regarded each other, woman and predator, each measuring the other's resolve. Then Bessie squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the evening quiet, and the lynx vanished into the trees with a snarl. She waited, listening intently, but heard only the renewed cackling of the relieved chickens, and Thomas's startled cries from inside. "It's all right, little one," she soothed, returning to scoop him up. "Just letting our visitor know this isn't his territory." She settled into the rocking chair Jonas had made, holding Thomas close as darkness gathered outside. The rifle remained within easy reach. The next day passed without incident, though Bessie kept a watchful eye on the tree line. She saw no sign of the lynx, but the tracks in the snow told her it had circled the cabin once before moving on to easier hunting grounds. She felt a fierce pride in protecting their home, in proving herself capable of handling whatever the mountain might throw at her. Jonas returned on the afternoon of the second day, his pack lighter and his step quicker as he approached the cabin. He stopped short when he saw the tracks, then the spent shell casing in the snow. His eyes snapped to Bessie, who stood in the doorway with Thomas. "Lynx," she said simply. "Came after the chickens. I convinced him to find dinner elsewhere." Jonas studied the tracks, then her face. Something like admiration crossed his weathered features. "You hit it?" "Didn't try to. Just wanted to scare it off." She shifted Thomas to her other hip. "No sense killing something that was just hungry, long as it learned to stay away." He nodded slowly, and she saw the respect in his eyes deepen. Without another word, he began unpacking his trades: coffee, sugar, new blankets, and a small bag of peppermint drops that made her smile. That evening, over a hearty stew of fresh rabbit and winter vegetables, they talked about the coming spring. The snow would start melting soon, making the trails passable again. Jonas spoke of his concerns about the railroad surveyors, their boots leaving marks on his land like harbingers of change to come. "We need to file that new deed," Bessie said, stirring her stew thoughtfully, "before they start claiming parcels." Jonas's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "We?" "I should be the one to go down," she said. "I can read the forms, write proper responses. Those officials don't take kindly to rough manners, and meaning no offense, but you've got the social graces of a grizzly bear." He frowned, but she saw the truth of her words sink in. "It's not safe," he protested. "The trail." "We'll be clearer by then," she interrupted, "and I know how to ride. Did plenty of it before." She trailed off, memories of her late husband's drinking and the gossip it had spawned flickering across her face. She straightened her shoulders. I can do this, Jonas, trust me. He was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas sleep in his cradle. Finally, he stood and went to a small box on the shelf. His mother's keepsake box, Bessie realized. From it, he withdrew something that gleamed in the firelight. Been meaning to give you this, he said gruffly, holding out a silver cross on a delicate chain. Was my mother's. Carried her through some hard times. He met Bessie's eyes. Reckon you should have it, especially if you're riding down to town. Bessie took the cross carefully, feeling the weight of its history in her hands. The silver was worn smooth from years of faithful wearing, its surface reflecting the flames like captured starlight. Jonas, she whispered. I can't. You can, he said firmly. And you will. For luck, if nothing else. She slipped the chain over her head, the cross settling against her heart like it belonged there. Thank you, she said softly, understanding the trust he was placing in her, not just with the precious heirloom, but with their future, their home, their chance at a real family. Jonas nodded, his expression tender in the firelight. Outside, a cold wind swept down from the peaks, rattling the windows and setting the flames dancing. But inside their cabin, warmth bloomed like spring flowers pushing through snow. The warmth of trust, of respect, of two people learning to lean on each other's strengths. Thomas stirred in his cradle, making those soft night sounds that never failed to draw them both to his side. As they stood together, watching him sleep, Bessie touched the silver cross at her throat and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For the courage to face down predators, for the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy, for the trust growing between her and this quiet mountain man who was slowly becoming more than just a convenient arrangement. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows on the walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, wood to split, meals to cook, plans to make for the spring journey ahead. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply a family sharing the peace of their mountain home, bound together by choice and trust and the small miracles of everyday courage. Jonas stirred the fire one last time, sending sparks dancing up the chimney like earthbound stars. His movements were sure and comfortable, no longer carrying the weight of solitude that had bowed his shoulders when Bessie first arrived. She watched him, this man who had offered her dignity when others had only mockery, who had given her his mother's cross and his complete trust. The evening settled around them like a warm blanket, full of quiet contentment and the promise of spring to come. Through the window, Bessie could see the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the mountain sky. The lynx's tracks would be gone soon, erased by melting snow, but the memory of standing strong against it would remain. Another piece of proof that she belonged here, in this life they were building together. The first warm breeze of spring whispered through the pines, carrying the sweet scent of melting snow. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath winter's white blanket, and tiny green shoots pushed through the softening ground. Nature itself seemed to mirror the hope blooming in Bessie's heart as she watched Jonas prepare the mules for their journey down to Aspen Gulch. His big hands moved with surprising gentleness as he adjusted the straps, checking each buckle twice. The pelts they'd carefully sorted and bundled lay ready, the winter's bounty that would help secure their future. Thomas cooed from his wrap against Bessie's chest, fascinated by the early morning sunlight catching the frost. "Reckon we've got everything secured," Jonas said, giving the lead mule's nose an affectionate pat. The animal pushed against his hand, eager for the treat he always kept in his pocket. "Been a good season for fur." Bessie nodded, touching the stack of carefully prepared documents in her saddlebag. They'd spent evenings by lamplight getting everything in order. Land descriptions, boundary markers, Jonas's testimony about his original deed. Her neat handwriting filled pages with the story of his claim, dating back to before the silver strikes brought crowds to these mountains. "The courthouse opens at 9 o'clock, she said, adjusting Thomas's wrap. "Should make it there by midday if we start now." Jonas cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Before we go?" He reached into his coat pocket, his expression unusually uncertain. "Got something to show you." Bessie's heart quickened as he withdrew a small object wrapped in a scrap of soft buckskin. His mother's silver cross, which he'd given her weeks ago, felt warm against her skin as she watched him carefully unfold the leather. In his palm lay a wooden ring, carved from a piece of pine with careful precision. The grain spiraled in a perfect circle, smoothed and polished until it gleamed like satin. Small details had been etched into the surface, tiny mountain flowers and leaves that must have taken hours of patient work. "Been working on it when you sleep," he said quietly. "Ain't silver or gold, but it's honest wood from honest land." His eyes met hers, deep with meaning. "Like to know if you'd stay. For good, if God wills it." Bessie felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought of the months they'd shared, the blizzard they'd weathered together, the nights spent teaching him to hold Thomas, the slow transformation of his cabin into a true home. She thought of his strength and his gentleness, how he'd defended her dignity that first day in the saloon, how he'd trusted her with his pain and his hope. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll stay." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though the wood had grown just for this purpose. Thomas gurgled happily between them as Jonas leaned down, his beard brushing her cheek as he pressed a soft, tender kiss to her lips. The moment was brief, but full of promise, like spring itself, carrying the seeds of all the seasons to come. When they parted, Bessie saw moisture in Jonas's eyes that matched her own. "Better get moving," he said gruffly, turning to adjust the mule's packs one final time. But his voice held a new warmth, and his steps seemed lighter as they prepared to leave. The trail down the mountain had changed since their winter journey up. Patches of mud replaced the ice, and the air grew notably warmer as they descended. Jonas led the way, choosing careful paths around the worst of the spring runoff. Bessie followed, one hand on her reins, the other supporting Thomas, who had fallen asleep against her chest. They passed the hollow where they'd found him, now green with new growth covering the old burn marks. Bessie said a silent prayer for the unknown parents who'd left him, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought him into their lives. By mid-morning, they could see Aspen Gulch spread out below them, the town larger than Bessie remembered. New buildings had sprung up during the winter, evidence of the coming railroad's influence already showing in fresh-cut lumber and ambitious construction. "Town's growing," Jonas observed, his voice neutral but his shoulders tense. "More reason to get our claim properly filed," Bessie replied, patting the documents in her saddlebag. "But it's still our mountain up there, no matter how big they build down here." He nodded, visibly relaxing at her words. The hour hadn't escaped his notice, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. They reached the outskirts of town just before noon. The streets were busy with spring activity, miners heading to their claims, merchants restocking after winter, wagons bringing supplies for the railroad crews. A few people stopped to stare at the odd pair, the massive mountain man and the strong-built woman with a baby, riding mules laden with furs. Jonas headed for the trading post while Bessie continued on toward the courthouse. They'd agreed it would be better to handle their tasks separately. Him trading the furs, her filing the land claim. Less chance of trouble that way, though Bessie noticed his reluctance to let her go alone. "I'll be fine," she assured him, touching the wooden ring on her finger. "Meet you at the general store when we're done?" He nodded, then surprised her by reaching up to squeeze her hand briefly before leading his mule toward the trading post. Bessie watched him go, marveling at how natural such gestures had become between them. The courthouse stood at the far end of the main street, its fresh paint and proper glass windows marking it as one of the town's more impressive buildings. Bessie took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and climbed down from her mule, securing the reins to a hitching post. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of paper and ink. A clerk looked up from his desk, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of her, a woman in practical riding clothes, a baby sleeping against her chest, and a stack of documents in her hands. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone professionally neutral. "Need to file a land claim," Bessie said clearly, setting the papers on his desk. "For Jonas Creed's property up Shadow Creek Way. Original deed was lost in a fire, but we've got all the documentation here. Boundaries, improvements, witness statements from old-timers who remember when he first settled." The clerk adjusted his spectacles and began examining the papers. Bessie waited patiently, knowing every detail was in order. She'd been thorough in her preparation, leaving nothing to chance. "This seems to be in order," he said finally, reaching for his official stamps. "Though I should mention, the railroad has expressed interest in several parcels in that area." "Mr. Creed's claim predates any railroad surveys by 15 years, Bessie replied firmly. "As those documents show." The clerk nodded, impressed either by her knowledge or her conviction. He began the process of recording the claim, his pen scratching across official ledgers as he transferred the information. Bessie felt a profound sense of rightness as she watched him work. This was what she'd come down the mountain to do: secure their home, protect their future. The wooden ring on her finger seemed to warm with the thought. When the clerk finished, he handed her the officially stamped and recorded documents. "Congratulations, Mrs. Creed," he said, and Bessie felt a little thrill at the name. "Your claim is properly filed and registered." She thanked him and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, triumph singing in her heart. Thomas was beginning to stir, ready for his feeding, but she wanted to find Jonas first. She led her mule toward the general store, where they had agreed to meet. She found him already waiting, his trading completed successfully, judging by the satisfied look on his face. His expression brightened further when he saw her, and she held up the stamped papers with a smile. "It's done," she said simply. "All official and proper." Jonas took the papers carefully, as though they were made of gold instead of paper. His eyes moved over the official stamps and signatures, then lifted to meet hers with profound gratitude. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," she corrected him, touching her wooden ring. "Together." The afternoon sun slanted warm and golden across the street, casting long shadows behind them. In a few hours, they would begin the journey back up their mountain, back to the home they'd made together. But for now, they stood in comfortable silence, sharing the satisfaction of a future secured and a love confirmed. Thomas chose that moment to wake fully, demanding attention with a hungry cry. Bessie laughed, bouncing him gently. "Someone's ready for his dinner," she said. "Shall we head home?" Jonas nodded, carefully storing the precious documents in his saddlebag. "Home," he agreed, and in that single word Bessie heard everything he wasn't saying: his gratitude, his love, his certainty that they belonged together. They mounted their mules and turned toward the mountain trail, leaving the growing town behind. The spring air was sweet with promise, and ahead of them stretched all the seasons of their life together, waiting to unfold like flowers reaching for the sun. Deputy Clay Burness watched from his office window as the large woman dismounted her mule outside the courthouse. His narrow eyes followed her movements as she secured her reins and adjusted the infant wrapped against her chest. Something about the scene bothered him, particularly the child's copper-brown skin visible against her pale dress. Inside the courthouse, he moved closer to the clerk's desk, pretending to study wanted posters while eavesdropping on their conversation. The woman, Bessie Holt, he recalled with distaste, was filing land claim papers for that mountain recluse, Jonas Creed. "Congratulations, Mrs. Creed," the clerk said, handing over the stamped documents. Deputy Burness stepped forward, blocking Bessie's path to the door. "Just a moment," he said, his voice honey-smooth with practiced authority. "I need to see documentation for that child." Bessie clutched Thomas closer. "What documentation?" "Proof of guardianship." The deputy's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "That appears to be a native infant in your possession. Without proper papers, that's a serious offense." "He's an orphan we found," Bessie said firmly. "We've been caring for him all winter." "Found, you say?" Burness raised an eyebrow. "Where exactly?" "In a burned wagon, south of Shadow Creek." "Did you report this to the proper authorities?" The deputy's voice hardened. "File a statement. Register with the Indian Agency?" Color rose in Bessie's cheeks. "We were snowed in. The baby needed immediate care." "So you admit to harboring an Indian child without proper authorization?" Burness interrupted. "That's a federal offense, Mrs. Creed. Or is it Miss Holt? Your marriage status seems as questionable as your guardianship claims." The clerk shifted uncomfortably at his desk, but said nothing. Bessie stood straighter, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This baby needed us. We couldn't leave him to die." "The law is clear," Burness said. "All Indian children must be registered with the agency. Hand him over, and we'll sort this out properly." "No." Bessie backed away, one hand protective over Thomas's head. "He's not going anywhere without me." The deputy's practiced smile vanished. "Stanley," he called to a young deputy lounging by the door. "Fetch the soldiers from the saloon. Tell them we've got an illegal situation here." "You can't do this," Bessie protested, but her voice shook now. "I can and I will." Burness produced a pair of iron handcuffs. "You're under arrest for unlawful harboring of an Indian child and interference with federal Indian affairs." "He's just a baby," Bessie pleaded, tears starting in her eyes. "He'll die without proper care." "The agency has facilities for such cases," Burness cut her off. "Now will you surrender the child peacefully, or must I add resisting arrest to your charges?" The sound of boot steps announced the arrival of 2 Army soldiers, their blue uniforms dusty from the road. Bessie looked frantically between them and the deputy, clutching Thomas tighter as he began to cry. "Please," she whispered. "He's our son now. We love him." "Love doesn't override federal law," Burness said coldly. He nodded to the soldiers. "Take the child. She's under arrest." What followed was a blur of struggle and tears. Bessie fought to hold on to Thomas, but the soldiers were strong and practiced at such separations. They pried the screaming infant from her arms, while Deputy Burness snapped the handcuffs around her wrists. "You're making a terrible mistake," Bessie sobbed, as Thomas was handed to one of the soldiers. "He needs me. He needs his family." "Take him to Fort Hallow Agency," Burness instructed the soldiers. "They'll know what to do with him." He turned to Bessie, gripping her arm. "As for you, you'll have time to consider your crimes in jail." The soldiers departed with Thomas, his wails echoing down the street. Bessie stumbled as Burness marched her toward the jail, tears streaming down her face. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion, but no one intervened. The cell was small and cold, with only a narrow cot and a barred window. Bessie sank onto the thin mattress as Burness locked the door with a satisfied click. "Someone will need to inform your mountain man," he said, hanging the key on a hook by his desk, "though I expect he'll hear about it soon enough." Bessie didn't respond, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All she could hear was Thomas's crying, growing fainter as the soldiers took him away. At the trading post across town, Jonas was finishing his business when a breathless boy burst through the door. "Mr. Creed," the boy gasped. "They've arrested Miss Bessie. The deputy took her to jail and the soldiers took your baby." Jonas's massive frame went rigid. "What?" "Deputy Burness said she was harboring an Indian child illegal-like. They're taking the baby to the fort." The trading post owner backed away as Jonas's face darkened with fury. Without a word, Jonas strode out, his boots thundering on the wooden sidewalk. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, checking its load with practiced fingers. People scattered from his path as he stalked toward the jail, his expression terrible to behold. Those who knew him had never seen such raw anger in the normally quiet mountain man. Some ran to warn the deputy, but Burness merely smiled and checked his own weapon. Jonas reached the jail just as Burness stepped onto the porch, hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Creed," the deputy said smoothly, "I'm afraid your woman has broken federal law." The rest of his words were cut off as Jonas drew his revolver with lightning speed, aiming it straight at Burness's heart. The deputy's own gun was only halfway cleared of its holster. "Open the cell," Jonas growled, his voice deadly quiet. "Now let's be reasonable," Burness said, though sweat had appeared on his brow. "This is a legal matter. Open it now, or I'll send you to meet your maker." The deputy's face showed real fear now. Jonas's reputation as a marksman was well known, and at this distance, there was no chance he'd miss. "Jonas," Bessie's voice called from inside the jail. She pressed against the bars, reaching toward him. "Jonas, don't damn yourself." Her words cut through his rage like a knife through butter. Jonas's hands trembled on the revolver as their eyes met through the iron bars. "He took Thomas," he said, his voice breaking. "They took our boy." "I know," Bessie replied softly. "But killing him won't bring Thomas back. It'll only destroy whatever chance we have of making this right." Long seconds passed as Jonas struggled with himself, his finger tight on the trigger. Burness hardly dared breathe. Finally, slowly, Jonas lowered the gun. It slipped from his shaking fingers and clattered to the wooden porch. He fell to his knees, overcome by grief and thwarted rage. "That's better," Burness said, quickly retrieving both weapons. "Now, you can join your woman in—" "Wait." A new voice spoke from the street. Margaret Thayer, the agency clerk and schoolteacher, stood watching the scene with keen eyes. "Deputy Burness, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about jurisdiction here." She walked forward, her sensible boots tapping on the wooden sidewalk. Though not a tall woman, she carried herself with the authority of her position. "This is a federal matter," Burness began, but Margaret cut him off. "As the Fort Hallow agency clerk, I'm well aware of federal Indian policy," she said crisply. "I'm also aware that any child found abandoned on public land falls under territorial jurisdiction first. The proper procedure is to file abandonment papers and temporary guardianship claims before any federal oversight begins." She turned to Jonas and Bessie. "If you're willing to file those papers now, we can begin the process properly. It won't guarantee permanent custody, but it will give you legal standing to petition for it." Hope flickered in Bessie's tear-stained face. You'll help us? I'll help justice be served correctly, Margaret replied. Deputy Burness seems to have overstepped his authority in this matter. The deputy's face darkened with anger, but he couldn't dispute her expertise in Indian agency regulations. The child is already en route to Fort Hallow, he said stiffly. Excellent. That's where we'll need to go to file the papers anyway. Margaret fixed him with a stern look. I trust you'll release Mrs. Creed into my custody. As agency clerk, I have authority to supervise such cases. Burness hesitated, then reluctantly produced the cell key. As he unlocked the door, Margaret turned to Jonas. Mr. Creed, I suggest you gather your witnesses, anyone who can testify to finding the child and your care of him through the winter. Meet us at Fort Hallow tomorrow morning. We'll need their statements for the guardianship petition. Jonas nodded, still shaken, but steadied by this unexpected ally and her practical approach. Bessie rushed to embrace him as soon as she was free, both of them trembling. We'll get him back, she whispered against his chest. The right way. The right way, Jonas agreed hoarsely, remembering how close he'd come to ruining everything with violence. He held her tighter, grateful for her voice of conscience when he'd needed it most. Margaret watched them with approval. I'll arrange temporary accommodation for Mrs. Creed near the fort tonight. Mr. Creed, I suggest you return to town with your witnesses as early as possible tomorrow. The sooner we begin the proper procedures, the better chance we have of resolving this favorably. As they prepared to leave, Deputy Burness called out, This isn't over. The railroad has interests in that mountain property. The railroad's interests don't override legal homestead claims or proper judicial process, Margaret interrupted firmly. Good day, Deputy. She led Bessie toward her waiting buggy, leaving Burness fuming on the jailhouse porch. Jonas watched them go, his heart torn between following and gathering the witnesses they'd need. Go get our boy back, he said gruffly to Bessie. I'll bring help. Bessie squeezed his hand once before climbing into Margaret's buggy. As they drove away toward Fort Hallow, Jonas turned toward the livery stable. He had riders to send out, men who'd known him 15 years ago when he first claimed his land, who could testify to his character and his right to build a family there. The afternoon sun cast long shadows down the street as he mounted his mule. The rage that had nearly consumed him had burned away, leaving something stronger in its place, determination to fight for his family the right way, with truth and law rather than bullets. He turned toward the mountain, already planning which of his old neighbors to visit first. Behind him, Deputy Burness watched with narrow eyes, but Jonas paid him no mind. His path was clear now, thanks to Bessie's voice of conscience and Margaret's knowledge of the law. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but they would face them together, with justice and proper procedure on their side. Deputy Burness took pleasure in slamming the iron cell door. Cool your temper overnight, mountain man. Maybe next time you'll think twice before drawing on an officer of the law. Jonas sat heavily on the wooden bench, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The setting sun cast long shadows through the barred window, painting stripes across the dusty floor. His fingers ached to hold his revolver again, to force justice from the barrel of a gun. But Bessie's words echoed in his mind. Don't damn yourself. Hours crept by. The jail grew dark except for a single oil lamp casting yellow light from the deputy's desk. Jonas closed his eyes, trying to picture Thomas's face, wondering if the baby was crying for them. The thought made his chest tighten with grief. Boot steps on wooden planks drew his attention. Reverend Cole's lean figure appeared, Bible tucked under one arm. Evening, Jonas, the preacher said softly. Thought you might welcome some company. Jonas grunted, not meeting the Reverend's eyes. Come to lecture me about turning the other cheek? No. Cole pulled up a chair, its legs scraping against the floor. Come to remind you that God's justice runs deeper than man's, and it runs on its own time." "Tell that to Thomas," Jonas muttered. "Tell that to Bessie, locked up for nothing but showing kindness to an orphaned child." The Reverend nodded slowly. "I understand your anger, but violence would only prove Deputy Burness right about you being dangerous. Is that what you want? To give him reason to keep you from your family?" Jonas's massive hands clenched into fists. "What would you have me do? Stand idle while they tear apart everything we've built?" "Stand firm," Cole corrected. "But stand righteous. Gather evidence. Collect witnesses. Show the judge and the Indian agency that you and Bessie are good people who found an abandoned child and gave him love." He leaned forward, voice earnest. "The law can work for justice when good people insist on truth." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, watching moonlight creep across the cell floor. 15 years ago, I lost faith that God cared about justice. Figured he'd turned his back on me when fever took my family. And now? Now. Jonas touched the wooden ring he'd carved for Bessie, still in his pocket. "Now I reckon maybe he was just waiting for me to remember what mercy looks like. Bessie showed me that." Cole smiled. "Then trust in that mercy. Fight with truth instead of bullets. Show them the man Bessie knows you to be." They talked through the night, the Reverend's quiet words helping Jonas channel his rage into resolve. As dawn painted the eastern sky pink, Deputy Burness returned to unlock the cell. "Get out," he sneered, "but watch yourself. One more incident like yesterday, and you'll face serious charges." Jonas straightened to his full height, looking down at the deputy. "I aim to watch everything real careful from now on," he said evenly. "Every legal step you take, every paper you file, every witness to how you treat folks." Burness's face tightened, but he said nothing as Jonas walked out into the crisp morning air. Reverend Cole followed, placing a steadying hand on Jonas's arm. "I'll start gathering statements," the preacher offered. "Plenty saw how that arrest went down. Mary Thompson from the general store, old Jim who runs the livery. Even the telegraph operator mentioned the deputy seemed mighty pleased about finding an excuse to cause trouble." Jonas nodded. "Much obliged, Reverend. I've got some visits to make myself. Folks who knew me back when I first claimed that land. Need their testimony about my character and right to homestead there." "Good man." Cole squeezed his shoulder. "I'll check on Bessie, too. Make sure she's holding up." Jonas's throat tightened. "Tell her." He swallowed hard. "Tell her I'm doing this right. Tell her to keep praying." The Reverend promised he would. As Jonas mounted his mule, determination replaced the helpless anger of the night before. He'd fight with truth now, gathering evidence against the deputy's corruption like a hunter laying careful snares. Days stretched into a week. Jonas rode from homestead to homestead, collecting signed statements from old neighbors. Reverend Cole brought word that Bessie grew thin, but remained strong in spirit, reading her Bible and praying in her cell. The preacher also reported that Thomas was safe at Fort Hallow, being cared for by the agency women, while the legal petitions worked their way through proper channels. Every evening, Jonas returned to town to file another document, submit another witness statement, or check on the progress of their case. He felt Burness watching him with suspicious eyes, but kept his temper in check. The deputy's time would come, not through violence, but through justice properly served. In his heart, Jonas knew this was his true test of faith. Not just believing God would make things right, but doing the patient work of proving their cause was just. Every signature gathered, every testimony recorded, was another step toward bringing his family back together, the right way, the way Bessie would be proud of. And in the quiet of each night, he prayed. Small, stumbling prayers at first, but growing stronger as the days passed. Prayers for Bessie's strength, for Thomas's safety, and for his own patience to see this through with honor instead of hatred. Jonas pushed his mule through spring-thawed trails, mud sucking at its hooves. 3 days of hard riding had left both beast and man bone-weary, but news of Thomas's fever drove him forward. The trading post's coins weighed heavy in his saddlebag, every pelt sold to buy medicine and supplies. Fort Hallow's weathered walls rose against gray skies. Inside the agency grounds, Jonas found Margaret Thayer, the clerk, tending to crying infants in the orphan ward. Thomas lay bundled in a rough wool blanket, his small face flushed with fever. Near the window, a tall Apache man stood watching, grief etched deep in his features. Jonas recognized the look. He'd worn it himself after losing his sons. "Your child?" Jonas asked softly. The man turned. "He walks with ancestors now. Winter raiders took him." His voice carried dignity despite pain. "I am Nantan." Jonas shifted Thomas in his arms, feeling the baby's heat through the blanket. "I'm right sorry for your loss. A father shouldn't outlive his children." Nantan nodded, studying Jonas's face. "You know this pain." "Lost my whole family years back. But God gave me another chance with this little one." Jonas hesitated, then spoke from his heart. "I need help keeping him. My land claim's threatened, railroads coming. But I've worked that valley 15 years. If you'll testify to that truth, half that land is yours to farm or hunt." Something shifted in Nantan's dark eyes. He touched Thomas's fevered brow with gentle fingers. "You would share your land with an Apache?" "I'd share it with a father who knows what it means to love a child." Together they walked to the agency chapel, where late afternoon light filtered through dusty windows. 2 men from different worlds knelt side by side, their prayers rising as one for a small life that had brought them together. Jonas rode back into Aspen Gulch with Nantan and Margaret Thayer beside him, hope rising in his chest like spring flowers through mountain snow. The courthouse creaked under heavy boots as they presented their case to the circuit judge, a thin man with steel-gray eyes who studied their papers with careful attention. Margaret Thayer's precise handwriting detailed the homestead's history. "I've kept records at Fort Hallow for 12 years, she testified. "Jonas Creed's claim predates any railroad survey." Nantan stood tall, his testimony clear and dignified. "I hunted those valleys when Jonas Creed first built his cabin. The land speaks truth. He has worked it long." From the back of the courtroom, Reverend Cole's voice rang out. "I've ministered to Jonas Creed's conscience. His word and his claim are sound as scripture." Deputy Burness's face twisted. Before the judge could issue his ruling, the deputy slipped out the courthouse door. Nobody tried to stop him. Justice had already spoken louder than any chains could. "Release Mrs. Holt and return the child," the judge ordered, his gavel crack sharp as rifle fire. Jonas found Bessie in her cell, thinner but glowing with inner light. Thomas reached for her from Jonas's arms, and she gathered him close, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank the Lord," she whispered. That night in the parsonage, they lay on separate cots in the spare room. Through the darkness, Jonas reached out, finding Bessie's work-worn hand. Their fingers intertwined, a bridge across the night until dawn painted the window gold. The journey home stretched before them like a promise waiting to be kept. Jonas led the way on his mule, while Bessie followed on hers. Thomas nestled securely against her chest, in a sling made from her shawl. The spring air carried hints of pine and melting snow, sweet with possibility. Each evening, they made camp beneath vast spreads of stars. Jonas built small fires that sparked and danced, while Bessie heated beans and coffee. Thomas cooed at the flames, his tiny fingers reaching for the light. On the second night, Bessie caught Jonas humming an old hymn as he rocked the baby. His deep voice, rough from disuse, brought tears to her eyes. "Reckon I remember more than I thought," he said softly, a smile tugging at his beard. By the third day, familiar peaks rose before them. As they crested the final ridge, Bessie gasped. There, next to Jonas's old cabin, stood the sturdy frame of a new house, twice the size of the original. Fresh-cut pine logs gleamed golden in the afternoon sun, and tiny purple wildflowers dotted the melting snow around the foundation. Jonas dismounted first, then reached up to help Bessie down. His massive hands settled gently at her waist as she slid from the saddle. Thomas blinked sleepily between them. "I built it for the family God sent me," Jonas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Bessie pressed her face against his chest, tears soaking into his wool shirt as spring winds whispered through the fresh-cut timbers of their future home. The mountain air turned crisp as May gave way to June. 3 riders appeared on the trail one afternoon, Reverend Cole astride his faithful mule Mercy, followed by Nantan and his wife Morning Star on painted ponies. They brought wedding gifts, a patchwork quilt, dried herbs, and blessings from 2 cultures. Before the cabin, Jonas and Bessie stood beneath an arch of pine boughs. Thomas, now growing strong and quick to smile, rested in Morning Star's arms. The scent of fresh-cut pine hung sweet and heavy in the air as clouds gathered above the peaks. Reverend Cole opened his weathered Bible, its pages fluttering in the mountain breeze. "Love bears all things, believes all things," he read, his voice carrying across the valley. Jonas and Bessie exchanged simple bands, his carved from pine, hers still the wooden ring he'd given her months before. "I take you as my wife," Jonas said, his deep voice steady, "before God and these mountains as witness." Bessie's eyes shone as she spoke her vows, promising to walk beside him all their days. As the first snowflakes began to dance in the air, Jonas took Thomas from Morning Star, cradling him between them. "You were right," he told Bessie softly. "You were built for birthing, hope into this world." The small gathering lifted their voices in "Amazing Grace," the hymn echoing off the mountainsides. Lanterns cast golden light through the falling snow as dusk settled over their homestead, blessing the new family with its gentle grace. The valley bloomed bright with wildflowers as spring painted the mountainsides in emerald hues. A letter arrived one morning, the railroad company's seal pressed into heavy paper. Jonas read it aloud to Bessie. The tracks would curve west, leaving their land untouched. An apology followed, along with compensation for their troubles. Their cabin had grown, room by room, as more children found their way to their door. Some came through Nantan's people, others from the mission school in town. Mixed heritage little ones who needed a home where differences didn't matter. The sound of young voices replaced the old silence of the mountains. Bessie's garden flourished behind the split-rail fence, rows of corn reaching toward the sky while peas climbed their poles. Jonas spent afternoons by the creek, teaching small hands to hold fishing poles and read the water's secrets. This Sunday evening, golden light spilled through the windows as the family gathered. Bessie held Thomas on her lap, his tiny fingers tracing the Bible's pages while Jonas read. His deep voice carried the ancient words with newfound grace. Laughter bubbled up between verses, the sound of joy echoing across peaks that once knew only loneliness. Their home had become exactly what they'd hoped, a sanctuary where love healed broken hearts and faith lit the darkest corners. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.